there are life lessons in sports. It's tough to win all the time.
In today's episode, I'm going to be interviewing Father Andy Chitty. His son, Sam, is now at Bucknell University in his second year. Our conversation revealed some interesting metaphors, ironies, and paradoxes to life. Some of the things that we covered or highlighted, or what you could call bullet pointed, were learning how to do the things that you don't like to do so that you can do the things that you want to do. Minimizing the pressure on children to succeed. Sports parents, politics, and perceived iniquities. Lessons that pay dividends. Intrinsic motivation. On Sam going to school 3,000 miles away from home. The psychology of transitioning from sports to life. As I said before, this conversation reveals some interesting metaphors, ironies, and paradoxes to life. I just gave you some bullet points, so stay tuned for this show. Welcome back to the show, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, heroes and villains. I'm your host, Deshaun Fauntleroy. I know your time is precious, so we're going to get right into today's show. In today's show, I have a parent coming on. His name is Andy Chitty. His son is named Sam Chitty. Sam played at Westland High School in the Portland, Oregon metro area. He's now at Bucknell College. I want to say that's in Pennsylvania. I have his dad coming on today. Again, we're going to, some of the questions that we're going to discuss or bullet points will be, what is your number one strategy that you use at home to develop discipline with your student athlete? When you find your student athlete procrastinating, how do you motivate him or her to take action? Finally, we'll discuss reflective thinking, and then we'll also close out with what are your common student athletes' barriers and limitations. So I want to welcome Andy Chitty to the show. Andy, would you like to tell my Sports Mastery audience a little bit about you and where you're at and where you're from?
Yeah, sure. I am a administrator at Oregon Health and Science University. I grew up out in the rural area outside Portland, Oregon. I grew up on a small farm, but then went to college outside of Portland, up at Evergreen State College, and then spent some time overseas in Hungary, living and studying over there, where I met my wife. We moved back to the States right around the early 90s, 91. Eventually, we raised our kids in West Linn, Oregon. Sam's the youngest of two brothers. And so, yeah, we've been in West Linn for all of Sam's life, and continue to live there now, even after the kids are off to college.
You know, I had the opportunity to train Sam, attend, I think that was his signing, his letter of intent, attend his letter of intent, his signing day, and also hang out with you guys at his graduation party before he was leaving for Bucknell. Mm-hmm. One of the things that always impressed me with Sam was not only his discipline, but he always came in with a sense of being humble, coming from one of the top schools in the state, one of the higher academic schools from a public school, and then from definitely one of the top football programs, in the Portland metro area. I was always struck by his humbleness, his willingness to help, and just his overall discipline. I found those to be some impressive things. So, getting into our discussion today, Andy, and you can reflect on his upbringing in middle school and maybe even on to his early high school and later high school years. I want to ask you, what was your number one strategy, and maybe this, you can consider your wife here too. Y'all's number one strategy that you would use at home to develop discipline with Sam?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of a tough question for us because on the one hand, Sam was pretty self-disciplined at quite a young age. He knew what he wanted to do, and he went for it. Sam's mom is a mental health therapist and is you know, quite educated, and I work within academia as well. And so for us, the world of sports, we love sports, but it was a little bit of a foreign world for us in terms of having so much invested into it. So Sam invested himself in that. I think, you know, from the standpoint of discipline, I think he saw us working hard as we built our lives back here. I think he felt that it was very important for him to academically do well. And we saw a lot of parallels in football and baseball in terms of being able to work hard on a skill. And I think that the team environment, we saw a lot of value in that, understanding that you have to be part of a team and you have to give and take in that team environment. And so we felt like it was a real analogy for life in general that was positive for him. We were lucky in the sense that he had a lot of passion for sports, for baseball and football, and was very active. And he kind of carried some of our requirements that if you're going to do something, you put effort into it, and it's not always all about fun and games. Sometimes it's hard work. But for us, it wasn't in our mind that he was going to later be a outstanding student athlete. We just thought it was a positive experience, and we wanted to turn that into something that made him think about, what does it take to be a productive member of the team. And there were times when we had to have some discussions about whether you're going to give up or whether you're going to continue on, and what does that mean for you going forward. So I think we just saw those as opportunities for teaching about the way life is going to be down the road.
Sure. And it sounds like as I was listening to you, you know, he had a chance to see you and your wife early on in your careers and just working hard and basically, you know, I don't want to sound cliché, but striving for the American dream with hard work and diligence. Was, you know, think about outside of sports. Did y'all, I mean, when it maybe, I don't know, how it went in the household with chores or cleaning up. You know, you can think in terms of discipline even outside of sports, you know, like the life lessons that were taught at home that might instill a certain way of thinking or discipline.
Yeah, I think we had our regular chores and things like that, but I think back to one time. There was a point where I had to go back to graduate school to retool myself, and that was when Sam was in late grade school, early junior high, and so I was getting my MBA at the time while working and making money where I could. It was, those are always, you know, pretty challenging times, but I remember, you know, Sam and I doing homework together and having a little bit of healthy competition with grades between us while I was going to grad school and he was going to school.
Sure.
Kind of infused that, made it a little bit more fun, and I think he saw perhaps saw that I had to put in some of the work myself to, you know, to make that change happen so that we could be more productive, or I could be a more productive member of the family, and how seriously I took it. I don't know how much of that instilled a sense of you know, responsibility towards his academics, or how much it was that Sam himself just really didn't like underperforming. You know, it was kind of part of his personality. But I do know that, you know, we had a little bit of fun competing with our grades, and that was kind of a cool time for us. And his mom, being a mental health therapist, I think she was able to provide him with a lot of emotional support throughout. Sports has its ups and downs.
Correct.
As far as daily chores and activities at home, Sam was relatively just like any kid. Had his good points and bad points about doing his chores and stuff. But overall, we tended to focus more on whether he was academically doing well, and then whatever activities that he was doing as far as sports went, it seemed to have a positive impact on his life. So we were willing to maybe not push the chores as hard, as long as he was keeping busy in other ways, in other productive ways. And we had a lot of, we certainly made it clear that we expected him to do well in those other areas.
So there were some expectations that were set at a very young age as far as being a student and being a person, of high character. That's what that sounds like.
Yeah, for sure.
I wanted to transition to our next bullet point, Andy, and this goes along the lines of where we're at in our discussion right now is, can you remember a time where you maybe found Sam procrastinating on maybe an assignment? It could be a chore around the house. In terms of that procrastination, what would you or your wife do to help motivate him to take action?
I think we just kind of had to tell him that this is something you need to do, and if you want to continue on with doing all the things you like to do, then you're going to have to get these other things done. Just letting him know that this is going to be part of life, doing some things that you don't want to do. To be honest, I don't remember a whole lot of difficulty with Sam procrastinating. I mean, it sounds kind of crazy, but he was never the type to want to leave things undone. Even with homework, or without really being pushed hard, he would come home and get that done after school before taking off to do something else, which, is, it seems quite unusual, but he didn't like having things not finished. I think there are times when I have to push him perhaps to go back and, for example, on a writing assignment or something, go back and do the extra work to wrap it up so that it's well proofed and well evaluated. Take a second and third and fourth look at it so that it's the best that it can be. I think in those cases, it's just a matter of reminding him that this is the kind of work that you have to do to make it to make something of the best value that you can.
If you're liking this show, head on over to Patreon, where you can learn more about the goals for sports mastery, but more importantly, you can see some of the rewards that I offer, even on the worst case scenario. If you're really liking this show, head on over to my Patreon page. That's patreon.com/sportsmastery. There you can learn the goals for the podcast, and more importantly, the unique rewards that I'm providing. It sounds like he's that ultimate balance of, he has that ultimate balance of intrinsic and external motivation, where he's definitely self-driven, but listening to your story, there might be times where he knows he would have to come home and do his homework in order to go to football practice or to do the things that he would like to do, outside of school or sports.
Yeah, and I think in those times when we did have to remind him, I don't think he's the type to feel like he wants to. It feels like to me that he doesn't really want to be reminded of something, and he kind of takes it to heart. And so, it didn't usually didn't take a lot of pressure on our part. Seemed like pointing out some issues was enough for him to take some action.
Sure. Considering where Sam is now, Andy, I believe he's finishing up his second year at Bucknell College. Am I correct?
Yeah.
And Bucknell's in the Patriot League.
That's correct. Yeah.
What does that mean as far as Bucknell being in the Patriot League? And, from what I understand, I believe it's a private school.
Yeah.
Could you tell our audience a little bit about, Bucknell College, or is it Bucknell College or Bucknell University?
Bucknell University. It is Patriot League, in the same league with Lehigh and Cornell. And so it's fairly prestigious institution for liberal arts, one of the better liberal arts colleges in the country, universities in the country. It's, I have to say, him getting a scholarship to that school, it's Aniko, Sam's mom, and I were overjoyed about that. It is rigorous academically, and they take their student athletes and the student part of the athletics very seriously, and I think it's going to prove to be a very positive experience for him overall. Certainly, it provides him with opportunities that are going to be outstanding from an academic point of view. So, he's in his sophomore year, and again, in college, he doesn't seem to require a lot of motivation to do well. He's getting good grades and doing quite well there. So I look forward to seeing where he goes from there.
Yes. I wanted to ask you, has he had any rough patches or difficulties, whether it was like socially or athletically, or even with the distance, while being out at Bucknell?
Yeah. I mean, I want to be careful that I don't say anything that Sam wouldn't want me to say out of respect for him.
Sure.
But I think he wouldn't object to me saying that moving that far away from home, that's in Pennsylvania, as you said, it's on the other side of the United States. And rural Pennsylvania is very different from the Portland metro area. So I think that was a bit of a culture shock for him, even though he kind of grew up in a bit of a multicultural household.
Sure.
His mom is from Hungary, although we're well sort of integrated into our own lifestyles here in the United States. But I don't know that he was really prepared for the level of culture shock that, and maybe the kind of the isolation that a small rural liberal arts college can. I mean, it can be isolating. It can be also very nice in the respect that you develop a close knit, tight knit community. So it can go either way with that. And I think his freshman year, that was difficult making that change, because he had a rhythm here in our house in Portland, where he'd go to school and train and go to football practice. I think he loved his football teammates, and he loved his coaching group. He really enjoyed working with people like you and with all those people who invested time in him to train him athletically. And that was a big change. So that first year, I would say, was probably pretty tough for him. It's much better this year, and I think he feels much more comfortable, much more at home there. So love to see that he's feeling better about things, and that he's really valuing his experience there.
Sure. Knowing your background and your wife's background, when he was, you mentioned that feeling of isolation and the distance being so far away,
Yeah.
and just the culture. What's the name of the town that he's in?
Lewisburg, Pennsylvania. It's in central Pennsylvania.
Lewisburg. Yes. What systems and strategies, or what kind of discussions would you and your wife have with Sam, to get through, those feelings of isolations, or just the first year of college, which we know can be, the most difficult year for most student athletes?
Yeah, that's a tough one, because you don't want to encourage your kid to go out and necessarily, socialize so much, or party so much that they don't study, and at the same time, you don't want your kid to isolate him or herself from the potential to go out and enjoy things, the kinds of things that college is all about. Not all about, but just some of the benefits of college is being able to meet people and socialize and integrate into a different community. So I think we had to be really judicious about our the way we wanted to sort of try to help him. And I think, being open to listening to him and listening to his concerns, and then at some point being able to say, look, I think you're going to have to suck it up on some levels and recognize that, okay, you're going to have to recognize that maybe there are certain things that aren't optimal, but again, that those are the kinds of things that sports teaches you. That's life. You're part of. You're in a situation that may not be comfortable, but you have to work through that. And there came a time when he had to make this decision about what he was going to do going forward with schooling. And I finally asked him, "Are you asking me to tell you what I think you should do?" And he said yes, and so we had that discussion. So it's a fine line. It's really hard as a parent to decide whether you're going too far and being over directive, or whether you should encourage your kid to go out and socialize, or whether you should encourage your kid to buckle down and study. You want to do the right thing, and it's not always clear.
Andy, thinking about where Sam has been so far, and you and your wife helping him with his experience, what would you say to other parents out there whose student athlete is on the path to college, and knowing what that first year is like, especially if you're going to be, about 3,000 miles away from home?
Yeah. I think, for us, and even for us, we weren't quite. I had a great time my first year in college, and so I wasn't prepared for those kind of first year challenges that a lot of students end up having. And so I think, remembering that there could be some difficult adjustments both for parents and the students. But from student athletes, as being a parent of a student athlete, on the one hand, Sam was really self-motivated. On the other hand, Aniko and I were concerned that, being an athlete is a difficult and risky proposition, because you may not be able to make it further than say sixth grade or seventh grade or high school, or even if you get a scholarship to a D1 school. In college, the competition just gets fiercer and tougher, and I think that the biggest challenge is handling, perhaps, or thinking about how you want to handle that pivotal moment when things are done, and recognizing that that's got to be really, really tough for the kid to go through, to recognize they've worked really hard and they were outstanding in high school or they were outstanding in junior high. Psychologically, to me, that's always been my biggest worry. What happens when it's done? How do we prepare? How do we help our kid get through that pivotal moment, and how do we prepare them in advance for that moment without sort of fire hosing their dreams? Because those are lofty goals to make it, even to get a scholarship in college.
It is,
and not everyone can achieve it. And certainly, once you get into college, not everyone can be first string. And the pros are just a ridiculous other level. So, how do you find that fine line between demotivating somebody because it is hard, but preparing them psychologically for inevitably, no matter how far they make it, they're going to have to retire?
Certainly, it sounds like you're doing a good job in knowing the background of your wife and where his brother is going as far as getting close to completing law school. And just with Sam being out there at Bucknell, knowing the history of that school and that league, I'm sure he's going to transition into society and into the corporate world or wherever he wants to be in a tremendous place. And that's what I always explain to my student athletes, that sports is just a stepping stone to get you to where you want to be in life. It's not going to last forever, but what's going to last is what concepts can you take from sports in terms of the discipline, the showing up every day, the time management, the persistence to take into the corporate world or take into whatever job or business that you would like to start. And from what I'm hearing from you and his mom, it sounds like he's on the path to success, and he's going to do some great things, after sports is over.
Yeah,
and that's what this is about.
I think that's really interesting, because if you can look at it that way, I think you really hit the nail on the head. Because if you can look at it from, there are life lessons in sports. It's tough to win all the time, and if you're in sports, you're going to lose sometimes. You're going to get beat sometimes. You're going to get hit in football. You're going to get hit hard, and you're going to deal with setbacks, maybe with injuries, or maybe setbacks because someone takes your starting position. I think one of the things that you mentioned, the term persistence, is huge. And so I think that if the end goal is to make your student athlete an athlete, then for me that's putting a heck of a lot of pressure that's on someone who's maybe not, it's not always in their control. They could have injuries that are completely outside of their control. If the end goal of participating in sports as a student athlete is to learn about how to persist and how to push ahead and continue on even in the face of adverse events, and be able to learn how to transfer those to the rest of your life if and when you have to face that moment where you have to choose another path for reasons outside of your control, or you choose to choose another path, then you've learned the lesson of sports, and you've used those lessons in a way that enrich and enhance your life going forward. That's what I'm most thankful for. And I, Sam may have been self-motivated, but it also could have been that wonderful coaches and mentors and teammates along the way inspired him to be that way. Hopefully we as parents had something to do with it too. But if you have good coaches who are tough but caring, as most of his coaches were, there's just lessons there that are going to pay dividends throughout the rest of the person's life, whether or not they make it as far as they want to in sports. Yeah.
Yes, I agree. And I often say, with the coaches and some of the things that we see in sports today is definitely more than sports. It's about caring for the student athlete, the coaches building a rapport and a relationship with the student athlete, getting to know the parents, so then, you're putting yourself in a place where you have a healthy relationship with the student athlete, so then they can remember and reflect on you 10, 15, or 20 years down the road and know that you as a coach really cared for them as a person, and it was beyond wins and losses. A lot of times us collectively or globally as coaches, we get caught up into just winning, or just trying to make the best athlete. And it's so much more than that. And, like we were discussing before, it's like when he makes that transition, it's the same as playing sports. You have to have a team. Like, you're going to be a part of his team. His mom is going to be a part of his team when he makes that transition, not only physically, but also spiritually and psychologically as well. So I think you're saying some incredible things, to the students. If you're listening to this, parents, if you're listening to this, coaches, if you're listening to this, check this out. Andy Chitty is sharing some valuable information with us, with his son that's a student athlete that's also a combination of brains and bronze. It's not easy to get into a school like Bucknell University. So before we close out, Andy, I would like to discuss, even when Sam was a middle school athlete or a high school athlete, or if there's a particular situation where you can reflect on his current situation now, what would you say some of his barriers and limitations are or were when he was younger?
I think that Sam had pretty high expectations for himself and teammates, and sports. Growing up in the sports activities, it is a community, and oftentimes it's a community of parent-coached teams. There are times when, as amateur coaches, I helped assistant coach. I got involved with the community. That's one of the most wonderful things about sports, is that you do develop a great community, and you see each other. Fortunately, you see each other at your best, and unfortunately, you see each other, and by each other, I mean parents and parent coaches and so on, at our worst. And there are times when those sort of, for lack of a better word, parent coaching politics become frustrating, particularly maybe for a kid who feels like there's some inequities in the system. I mean, while I participated as a coach, I was never knowledgeable enough to be a head coach or anything like that. I mean, I participated as a helper. I think that there were times perhaps when those kinds of things would enter the realm of whether or not perhaps you got to play. And I think sometimes Sam would allow some of those things to frustrate him, right or wrong, frustrate him, at least in the way he perceived it. And then perhaps his behavior or attitude would suffer. And I'm talking about maybe more middle school or early junior high, perhaps. In that there were times when he had to recognize that there's going to be some perceived, real or otherwise, inequities in every system, and you can't let it get into your head and allow it to you can't allow it all. You can't always show all of your frustrations in that situation, in your relationship with your coaches and so on, because it gets perceived as perhaps a bad attitude, and then that doesn't help you move up in the standing of the coaches and the rest of and the people that are there who are making those decisions. Those are difficult and complex relationship ideas to navigate as a kid who's maybe 12, 13 years old. It's really hard to explain I'm even having a hard time explaining it right now, but it's really hard to get that across to a young kid who perceives something to be unfair or unjust. But at the same time, that's the reality of the situation. That's part of being a community. We were just lucky to be in a community that tends to work through those problems, and through thick and thin, we've always stayed friends with 99+% of all the people that we went through all this with. So we were lucky, but it made it's challenging sometimes, and it's challenging for a kid.
Sure. I can appreciate you taking the time to discuss this because, what you're talking about is often termed as, sports politics. Is also termed as favoritism, or the dad playing his son, or the coach playing, the family members. And and the epitome of sports mastery is definitely about helping the kids develop social intelligence, but more so emotional intelligence, and how to control your emotions, but also how to express yourself. And that's one of the things I think it works on the other end, where I always encourage parents to get to know the coaches. So then when it is time to have a meeting, the student athlete and the parent can go have a conversation with the coach when it's warranted, versus it is just the student athlete having a conversation with the coach. There are times for that, but depending on the age of the athlete, sometimes kids don't understand the power dynamic, and sometimes coaches don't know how to best communicate with the kid. That could be, you could do significant damage, because words have power, and words can cause you to act a certain way. So I really appreciate you sharing that. And, as in life, there's going to be some hardship and turmoil somewhere. It's just how we're taught to deal with it from a social and emotional standpoint. Yeah. So Sam, it sounds like
I think you put that really well, because one, we worked hard to step back and let Sam talk to coaches himself. I think that there is a time for a parent to step in, but I think a lot of parents are all too eager to step in, and sometimes that makes it worse. But sometimes it is an unjust situation, and no amount of stepping in as a parent is going to make, say, a coach who doesn't have good intentions, which I don't think many coaches are that way, but I'm sure there are. But there may be times when you just have to tell your student athlete that this is a temporary situation that isn't very good. But we always encourage Sam to first try to have those conversations himself, so that he learned how to advocate for himself, as long as the situation was not a potentially harmful one to him. And those are all really difficult judgment calls on the part of a parent who obviously really loves their kid. And the favoritism, whether real or perceived, is something that you just have to deal with and understand that that's a part of our community. But I think most coaches have really good intentions.
Yes. Andy, I want to thank you for coming on. Is there any other advice or words of wisdom that you'd like to give to the parents of student athletes out there, or to other coaches?
I think that, looking at, I think that expectations are a big issue. Again, going back to, do you expect your child to do well in sports, or do you expect your child to do well in life? I think if you can go with the latter category, it will help you to think sensitively about what your child really likes. If at any point in Sam's life he'd said, I really am not enjoying football, the last thing I would want him in is football, because it's a difficult, dangerous, and rough sport. I just think that if you can look at it as, what are my goals for my child? it's still heart-wrenching to see your child struggle in sports, even if they really like sports. But it's and struggle is a part of it. But I think that keeping in mind the ultimate goal may not necessarily be that they do good in that one or any particular group of sports, but rather what kind of lessons they learn along the way, and how they can leverage those lessons to make them to make their lives better overall and more productive.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you're liking this show, head on over to patreon.com/sports mastery. There you can learn more about the mission of Sports Mastery. You can learn more about our goals for the podcast, and you can also see our rewards for being a supporter of the podcast. Peace and blessings, and thank you for listening.